Hello, fellow creative voyagers. I am Matty Dalrymple. I'm the author of the Anne Kinnear suspense novels and suspense shorts and Lizzie Ballard thrillers. And I also write, speak, podcast, and consult on the writing craft and the publishing voyage as the indie author. And this is my video series, What Writers Can Learn, that is open live to past guests of the Indie Author Podcast, as well as patrons. And in this series, we talk about what writers can learn, especially focused on tropes, and you'll find out why in a moment, based on movies. I think we've done all movies so far, but the ones we've already talked about in the past, and these are all available on YouTube in the playlist, What Writers Can Learn from Movies. This would be on the Indie Author YouTube channel. What Writers Can Learn from Inside Man, from Knives Out, and from 10 Cloverfield Lane. And today we are going to be talking about the Royal Tenenbaums. And so I just wanted to let the participants briefly introduce themselves. And I'm going to start out with my co-host for this series, Jennifer Hilt. So Jennifer, tell us a sentence or two about yourself.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Maddie. This is always super fun. I am a fantasy author, and I've written a whole bunch of books, and I'm the author of the Trope Thesaurus series, which has 5 books out in it. And I love looking at story structure and how tropes can do a lot of heavy lifting for us.
Perfect. Thank you. And Mary, do you want to give a couple sentences about yourself?
Sure. Mary Van Everbroeck. I live in southeastern Pennsylvania, and I'm a writer.
Great. Thank you. And Roland.
Hey everybody, I'm Roland Denzel. I am primarily have been a nonfiction author, but I'm starting to delve into fiction so I'm writing an urban fantasy series, and I love the concept of tropes and how we can use them, not abuse them, and I love and I've enjoyed this movie too, so it's kind of caught my attention. So. Looking forward to it.
A fellow fan.
Yay! We are turning us all into fellow fans.
Okay.
Jennifer. So I just wanted to start out reading the first paragraph from the Wikipedia entry for the Royal Tenenbaums, just because I needed to refresh my memory. It had been a little while since I'd watched the movie. I needed to refresh my memory. And as I was just saying before we started recording, I was reading the Wikipedia entry and I thought, is this the same movie that I watched? And we'll get into that through this conversation. And this is also, I think, helpful for anyone who wants to learn about tropes but hasn't seen the movie. So The Royal Tenenbaums is a 2001 American comedy drama film directed by Wes Anderson and co-written and starring, we'll get to all that, ostensibly based on a non-existent novel and told with a narrative influenced by the writing of J.D. Salinger. It follows the lives of 3 gifted siblings who experience a great success in youth and even greater disappointment and failure in adulthood. The children's eccentric father, Royal Tenenbaum, leaves them in their adolescent years and returns to them after they have grown, falsely claiming he has a terminal illness, and he works on reconciling with his children and his ex-wife. And so I thought it was interesting, Roland, you had said learning to use but not abuse tropes. And I think something that's really interesting about this movie, and Jennifer, maybe this is why you picked it, is that this is in no way subtly using tropes. It's a little pretty much like slapping you in the face with the tropes intentionally, because I think that he was going for that sort of over the top, almost cartoonish use of it. So Jennifer, I'm just going to ask you to start out our conversation about tropes in the Royal Tenenbaums.
Sure. Yes. I think, well, one reason why I love this movie is because it's an original screenplay that he wrote. And because I've loved it so much, I've read all these interviews and listened to the commentary about it. And I also am a big fan of Gene Hackman. And so it was just a no-brainer when it was going to come out. But what I like is that it is for me, it feels still like a very fresh story, but I was realizing the reason why is it kind of taps. I also like his kind of world building and fantasy kind of stuff that we'll talk about. But I don't know if you guys ever remember reading as kids the mixed up files of Basil E. Finkweiler. I think I looked it up this morning. And it was about the 2 kids who ran away from home and went and lived in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it was kind of like a big kids book when I was younger. So you guys might be too young for that. But it was really funny because I was like, oh yes, this is like the grown-up version of that. It's a fantasy of what it's like to be, a Tenenbaum. And so for me, I love that experience of it. And the tropes just kind of, immediately helped to suck me in. And
Jennifer, I'm just going to jump in because I realized that the one thing I forgot to mention in the intro is at the end, we're going to ask you guys to say one thing that you learned that you'd want to apply to your own writing from the Royal Tenenbaums, and one thing that you saw happening that you would explicitly not want to apply in your own writing. And I think, Jennifer, what you're saying, which is a good lesson, a pro lesson, is that creators can take something that is not in itself at a superficial level completely original and make something completely original out of it, as I think he has done with this movie.
Yes, yes. So I was just realizing today, oh, I had loved that movie as a kid, and this kind of like almost like furthered or reignited that experience for me as like, oh, this would have happened, this could have been the adult version of that. So it was just kind of interesting. I'm really curious now if he read that book as a kid. But I guess what I think is really interesting about this movie trope wise is I feel like it's a very character driven movie. There is, as we can talk about, some action and stuff, but I really felt like he used tropes to like set up who the characters are and then kind of dig down deeper into like the various levels of them, so they weren't two-dimensional unless he wanted them to be. And there's some good examples of how he used kind of flat or two-dimensional characters as constructs or as contrasts. So that's kind of like why I just love how he did the characters. And I guess the central character of all this revolves around is Royal. And there's just so many, like even his name Royal, and playing on the kind of royalty trope and the way that house is set up of like these. Early on, we see the flag flying and with the kids, and just kind of like, oh yeah, this is going to be somewhat, fantasy of what it's like to live in this make-believe kind of world. And when I watch this movie, I feel like I'm transported to that place. And it's not, sometimes we watch a lot of movies and a lot of stories where you enjoy it, but at a more superficial level. And this one I felt engaged me deeper than that. But I don't know. It would be kind of interesting to hear from you guys, like what were your initial impressions of it? And then we can talk more about like specific tropes or how that kind of works. I didn't want it to all just be me fangirling.
Well, I thought that you had mentioned something about, I think you were saying seeing yourself in the setting or something like that. And one thing that I thought was interesting is that although it very obviously takes place in New York City, and I think there are a lot of like location tropes that are used in New York City, like you can kind of shorthand where a character is or where they live or where the scene's taking place based on what you show, what part of New York City you show in the background, and that this intentionally, what's the term I want? Airbrushed out some recognizable things or mashed together, made kind of a mashup so that they were both recognizable and yet not true to life. And so it was kind of playing with that, what would otherwise be a location related trope about that. I'm wondering if anybody else noticed that or reacted to that.
The that house that they used to film it at is still really popular and people still go by it. They've revealed the physical address. So I haven't done that when I've gone to New York. Actually, I think maybe I'll try to do that one time. But I just think that's really interesting because you're right. It's a very I think a romanticized version of the world that they live in. And that's part of like the allure. I think with his movies, that's why I'm really like, oh, I can't believe that other people are interested in this, because I feel like you're either a Wes Anderson fan and you really like his storytelling, or you're just like, oh, cannot stand it, But I don't think there's a lot of people that are kind of like lukewarm about it, about other, where you can kind of be like that about other kind of storytelling. So that's interesting to me that he can have such like generate this passion of people who, like I say, either love him or loathe him with his storytelling.
If it weren't for you, Jennifer, I wouldn't have watched the movie. I had tried or read the script. I tried years ago and I thought this is ridiculous, and I just turned it off. So I was one of those people. But then when I got into the tropes, and I was of course older and supposedly more mature, I was really able to. I mean, I thought it was genius. How there were so many things going on simultaneously with the tropes. And the one character that just really, I think he did so well, I'm not going to remember her name now, his wife,
Oh yes, Ethylene.
Who played her? I forget.
Anjelica Huston.
Yeah. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. How
Yeah.
she was able, she is quite an actress.
Yes.
How she was able to switch, like when
Mhm.
the guy proposed to her, that face shot,
Right.
and then how she hit him,
Right.
when he told her that he was going to die, and then he said, "Oh, I'm not," and all that. I mean, the care, just amazing as far as acting, but just tons of tropes. I mean, I'm still laughing about. I've had Dalmatians all my life, but I'm
Yeah.
still laughing over the mice and it had to be a Dalmatian that he got him.
Right.
It just had to be.
Oh my gosh, I never even thought about that. The part I thought was but you're totally right. I hadn't made that connection. And I was just laughing about that exact scene last night with my husband. What I thought was funny was Royal said, "Well, he doesn't look like a purebred, so I'll give you like $50 for him or something." And it's a Dalmatian. Like he just cannot stop lying. It's more,
Well,
so,
and that proved to him that he loved his son. I forget
right.
Richie, yeah.
Yeah.
There's so many good and there's family tropes in there. There's healing tropes. There's redemption tropes. There's all sorts of stuff,
Yeah. The scene that you were talking about is where Royal meets Ethylene on that street corner.
Mm-hmm.
I think is so great because you're right. It is completely packed with tropes, but it's also like, how we talk about oh my gosh, no, my mind is, but kind of like tempo beats in writing. And that was such a perfect example of it because he's just completely jerking her around, both physically and emotionally of, what's going on. And it was just so fascinating of the tropes. He's just like whipping out there, of, like you said, like, oh, the ticking time bomb of, oh, baby, I'm dying. And then, redemption. And he needs, and he wants to move back in. And then she gets all upset. And so he tries to take it back and she hits him, like, it was just great of like, oh, violence. And, it's just, yeah, he packed a lot into that one scene of how they physically met. And it's a really great example, I think, of how it's on the idea of a meet cute, when because I think was one of the early scene. I don't know if that's the first one that we see with them together, but it was like really gives you an idea of what that relationship between them was like, both showing it to us, like the distance between them. They really seemed like they were never on the same page, even when they did the flashbacks. It was just, it's one of really my favorite, and it's because I think they had really good material and they did a great job, delivering it.
And then the writer follows it up with that one sentence he tells his not butler, but I forget what his name is. She may have had a lot of affairs, but she's still my wife. It's like, what? It's like, what?
Yeah.
We talk normal,
Yeah, we talk about that that alpha hole trope, and I think Royal is definitely that way, where he's just like, he's such a jerk, like but I was thinking about how that is such a large part of his personality, and he's so, like you said, like that possessive, ownership thing. But what I think helped him from being, he was an obnoxious character, absolutely, but the scenes with him and his grandsons counterbalance that, where you could see, oh, there's kind of this redemption trope going, because he realizes he just completely missed the boat with those older kids, but he's trying to kind of change that with the younger ones. I just love that, where he says, when they're outside working out on the playground, he's like, how many times he's got you working out a week, Yeah,
that was interesting. I found the whole taking the grandkids out interesting, both as a trope and as a reflection of things that you probably couldn't get away with now.
Yeah.
Because none of the things he does with his grandkids are admirable. He's shoplifting and stuff like that. But then they have the scene where he takes them to the dog fight. And I thought, if he was making that movie today, would he have included the dogfight scene? Because as soon as I saw the dogfight scene, all that sort of illogical, slight warm and fuzziness I had felt toward Royal evaporated.
Right. And that he the way when he brings them back and the dad's like, oh my God, where have you guys been? And is that blood on his face? And he looks down and he takes his thumb and wipes off, like, oh, this dog's blood. Just like he just does not get it,
Yeah. And I will say for any potential viewers, they do not actually show the dog fighting is implied but not shown, but still it's kind of creepy.
Yeah. I mean, he has zero sense of kind of, class or really what you should be doing. It's appropriate.
Well, I would be curious. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear in other ways, especially with the use of tropes, how it influenced people's opinion of the Gene Hackman character, because I could never kind of get past, even before the dogfighting implication, I couldn't quite get past feeling like I would care that much if Royal Tenenbaum fell out of my life.
Yeah.
Roland, do you want to say anything?
Well, I mean, it's hard because like if he's your dad, it's like, a lot of us have had relationships with like siblings or something like that. And like, that's still my dad. So you have this connection that you can't really, or it's harder to get away from or harder to let go.
Yep.
So I think they did a fairly good job of showing that. And, like he is this person who is like not a good person. And even when his redemption arc, he tries to do his redemption arc, like the things that he chooses to do, he chooses to bond, but over the wrong things, like, bonding is good, but like, let's pick all the wrong things to bond over. Right. So I think that was, so I think we can put ourselves in that position, or at least I could.
Yeah. And now that you say that, I realize one way that Wes Anderson did that was through the kids, because there was the tension with the kids of like Chaz, the older brother, Richie was the one who was like always the closest to the dad, the tennis player. And he seemed like kind of like the stand-in for, there's good qualities with the dad, like his heart's in the right place, even though the other two were clearly treated so, even like really terribly. So I thought that I like you, I could totally understand and identify with this kind of sibling tension and family tension of not everybody feels the same way about or has the same kind of relationship with even just, a parent. And I thought it was like neat how he kind of did that. And the kids are still working out those dynamics years later.
But
yeah,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, sorry.
No, mine's a little bit of a different
Jennifer,
topic, so I want to make sure you complete yours.
That's okay. I was going to ask Jennifer, is it a trope that the one that Royal has, or Chad is the one, right? Chad's the one with the two sons?
Yes.
Okay. Is that a trope that relationship was cemented before he died? It was better. Of all the kids, that he kind of made peace, and Chad kind of made peace and was set free. Because the end scene where, they all walk away from the grave. I think Chad had the dog, the Dalmatian. I'm not sure, but is that a trope?
I would say, yeah, it's part of that like redemption trope, because especially when Chaz rides, when he like in kind of towards the very end, and he does have a heart attack, and Chaz rides with him in the ambulance.
Right. Okay.
That was like, I thought, okay, yeah, he has kind of like what Roland was saying. He's accepted. He's my dad. He's not what I would have wanted. I certainly deserve better, but he's just kind of able to, in an adult way, as opposed to kind of, that character is interesting because he's still very like an infantilized, I would say, the Chaz character, like with the sweatsuits, and he's still like, even his body language, a lot of times he's sulking and he's, pouting and doing all these things. So he's still very much stuck in being a kid, even though he's a father himself. And I feel like we saw the Chaz character like move into adulthood through that through kind of understanding his relationship with Royal. So kind of like he was able to be healed by it, even if Royal wasn't a different person, was kind of how I would view it. But yeah, definitely like that redemption, the whole redemption, second chance thing was what that played there. But yeah. What were you going to say, Roland?
Earlier, when we first started, I said I didn't want to abuse the tropes, right? So but you can sort of look at this movie as totally abusing all of the tropes, right? But because there's so many of them and they're so over the top, right? But the fact, how do you pull that off in writing? Because like in a movie, you can tell at a glance that these people are parodies of the trope, right? Here's the trope, and I'm going to heap so much on it that it's a parody. You can instantly tell, like, oh, it doesn't have to be believable, like, because I've heaped so much on there. But in a book, like, how do you do that? Because
Yeah,
it
I know
seems
what you're
like it's
saying.
much harder.
Yeah, because you don't have the visual aspects, because this guy is like such a master of that. I think in a book we do it by world building, but we do it like in layers where we can't like just show them the world all the way. So we talk a lot with tropes about like genre expectations. So like for this one, because it is a family thing, we would expect that yes, there would be like redemption arcs and people are working through things through and like maturing as characters. And so we kind of see that slowly happening, through the whole movie. And I think it's just kind of putting those tropes as they mature in different scenes in the movie is kind of how we build it in writing, as kind of opposed to just seeing, all of the visual elements of it. That's kind of like my best way to describe it is, or the thing that I've been thinking about recently is like when we have a trope. So like in this one, say, let's pick a trope for like the redemption trope. I would try to show how that redemption trope works through like, okay, we see in the beginning, the kids don't have a good relationship with him and they want to fix it. And then we kind of show how that happens. Oh, they move back home because they want to be with him because he's supposedly dying. And then that creates the conflict of like, they kind of 2 steps forward, 1 steps back. And then he gets kicked out when they realize, he's lied. But then they still kind of at the end come to, so like, I would just kind of split it into scenes. And in the scenes, I'd think, oh, am I weaving these tropes in the scenes in that way? Does that help?
That is also when you said earlier, when you said world building, that
Yeah.
kind of sparked something. So it's been a long time since, forgive me for the details, so the lack of details. But I read, is it Tom Robbins, like Still Life with Woodpecker? I don't know if you've read
Oh,
that.
I know that. I know that it's the author, Tom Robbins, you mean, right?
Yeah, Tom Robbins,
Yeah.
or also some Kurt Vonnegut is like this.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
so
Right.
at the very beginning of the book,
Mhm.
there's something that's so ridiculous
Mhm.
and so over the top that it sort of sets the stage for the rest of the, so it's like, it's not necessarily like a prologue
Right.
specifically, but
Yeah. Right.
in the opening chapters, something happens that really
Right.
sets the stage
Mhm.
and says, this is the kind of levels of things you're going to expect
Exactly.
from this book.
Yes.
I actually just I have fun doing this with ChatGPT. I put in what are 10 books that use tropes in the same way that the Royal Tenenbaums does. And one of the ones it
Oh,
came back
wow.
with was A Confederacy of Dunces by John
Oh,
Kennedy Toole. This comedic novel features a cast of eccentric characters, including a larger-than-life protagonist, Ignatius J. Riley, and explores their misadventures. So that would be a cool one to look at
yeah.
after to see how he
Mhm.
sets up, Roland, exactly
There's-
what you were asking about.
Yeah, there's one that I really, really like called The Family Fang. It has nothing, it's not paranormal or anything.
That's
And
the other one it mentioned.
oh, I was going to say Patrick DeWitt. I love that. I think they made a movie out of it. I don't know that, but I really love that. If you liked this movie, I think you'd like that. And it does a lot of the similar things. What other ones did they say, if you don't mind me asking, just out of nosiness?
The Addams Family. While not a
Oh.
book, the Addams Family cartoons and comic strips by Charles Addams share a similar dark and eccentric humor.
Mhm.
They have the corrections by Jonathan Franzen,
Oh, I haven't read that. That's it.
the Glass Family stories by J.D. Salinger,
Uh-huh.
including Franny, and I never say this out loud because I don't know how it's pronounced, Cooey, Zoe.
Zoe. Oh, uh-huh. Probably Zoe, yeah.
The 10-Year Nap by Meg Wolitzer.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I haven't read anything by her, but I know the name. Uh-huh.
The Royal Family by William Faulkner.
Hmm.
Middlesex by Jeffrey
Yeah, I don't know how to say it.
Eugenides. And the other ones I don't recognize, but I'll put a list of the ones that I
Oh,
found
interesting.
into
Yeah.
the notes for the video.
Yeah. Well, thanks for indulging. I haven't been using that, but that's really interesting. And it makes me
It's fun for brainstorming.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really but kind of trying to go back to your question. I think it's that I think that really that is the key with tropes, is that to bring them into your world so that it isn't just a dump of them, and that, like he did so well visually with that, with this. But yeah, and then you're just kind of like doing it by the specifics of, who they are, like the aspects of, like, the one's a tennis player, but he's also a painter, and he's got a thing for his adopted sister, and kind of things that are like, okay, you wouldn't necessarily think would maybe go together. I think his ability to kind of put those quirkiness with the characters is what moves them just beyond the trope of being like just, this rich tennis genius superstar. But
Also interesting that when you dial up the tropes so much to where they're this exaggerated, it kind of gives you the ability to call out things that like you wouldn't normally be able to call out in real life, right? So it's like you're a caricature, and you can bring up these ridiculous things that, like, in a more serious movie, or even a more traditional comedy, like you wouldn't be able to do. It's reminded me of there's this comic strip called Strange Planet, I think, where it's like these aliens. I follow them on Instagram, and it's these aliens experiencing life on Earth, and they can really call out these ridiculous things about life on Earth because they're aliens.
Right.
But they're aliens, like it's like they're aliens living a normal human life in normal human houses. And it's just interesting that you can do that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking about like because with the detailed world building, the play that Margot does when she's a kid, and then you just flash on the kids up, like on the and she did it for her birthday, and they just flash on the scene for a minute, but whatever it was like I just remember it was kids in animal costumes, and there was like blood on the costumes and like a gun, and it was just like, what the heck is that? Like, that's not what you think of a 10-year-old, a kid's play thing. It was just like, so it was like, made me go, what? And then the kind of, you see, when they asked the dad, Roland, Royal, his reactions, he was like, well, it's just a bunch of little kids, in costumes putting on a play. And you just see your basic, and like the mother comes in, just like all those family, like he's totally missed the boat again, but yet you're seeing all these different perspectives of like the girl, Margot, flounces off, the mother's coming in with the cake, everything's ruined, her like frown, and just kind of like how he put so much into that one scene of all the different characters' reactions to each other, and to kind of him being there. So it's like a lot of like a good forced proximity. I felt it was like a really good kind of, if you want to talk about using forced proximity in a scene, that was one of my favorite ones because they were all together.
Yeah.
Were there other examples of that, of the forced proximity trope that were especially notable?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think forced proximity and ticking time bomb, with forced proximity with him moving home, Royal moving home, which was great. And they're like, well, he can't stay here. And so the kids have already been moved in. And so Richie says, well, he can stay in my room. And so they're all like, ugh. So that was great. And then just his sneakiness of having him in the house, but they kind of know that he's there. They suspect, having been lied to so many times. So I think that's a really great example of the forced proximity trope, is just having them all in that house together, and then under the ticking time bomb auspices of, that he's supposed to be dying of stomach cancer when, he's eating cheeseburgers and drinking and doing all his regular stuff. So those were definitely, and then it gives us the sense of too, like, this situation can't go on forever. It's gotta have, it's like an end point. If this story didn't have that, and it could just drag on for years and years, it would lose the kind of cuteness and the kind of fantastical element and the urgency. It would just, I think, be more like real life.
Sometimes boring.
Yeah, boring and stressful, and like you're trapped in a space with some very not nice people.
Do you know why? No, I can't think of his name. The one who was married to Margot.
Yes.
That whole bit.
Yeah.
Him and his student.
Yes.
Why were they there?
Yeah. I think, like, when we talked about, I think that those were kind of used really more purposefully not developed characters to kind of highlight the choices that I think the choices that like Margot made to be with, like, because between him and that guy she's having an affair with, they were kind of like these dense characters who didn't have much depth to them. Even this guy who's supposedly a doctor, he seemed, not really like a doctor, or not anybody who had any emotional like weight to him. So I think they were just there to show how her life was very kind of closed off, and she'd been so hurt that she was making these choices to keep herself relatively safe by being in relationships with men that were so kind of far beneath her creative ability or her intellect. But they were very like undesirable. Both of them. One was just kind of vain and stupid, and the other one was also vain and, a drug addict, and also not particularly bright.
And yet her character didn't have much substance. I mean,
Yeah,
I don't know what trope. I have to look at your tropes again, but
I think
false identity or
yeah. Well, I think there was like the whole scar thing with her missing finger. Remember how she disappeared for a while when she was a teenager? I mean, that's just like so over the top, and that she returned like 2 weeks later, and she's missing a finger. And then I think also with her, it's supposed to be kind of this whole tortured soul thing where she is in love with her brother, her adopted brother, but knowing that kind of can't go somewhere, so she just makes increasingly bad choices all the time. Like where she says, "Oh, I think we just have to be secretly in love with each other," while they're sitting in this like tent that they made as little kids, like they're still arrested in that time. Yeah, I think she is kind of more of an object in terms of how she dressed and how she acted, and she certainly wasn't like the mother who you could see like more sides to her.
It's interesting that of all the oddities that he gave the characters, like the Gwyneth Paltrow character being, smoking a lot and being very promiscuous, you can, see those are like easy shorthand for a self-destructive personality. But then there were other oddities that Ben Stiller, I'm just going to go with calling them the characters' names because it's easier for me to remember. Ben Stiller with always the tracksuits, and the other guy, one of the, is that the tennis player?
Yes.
Him doing the, the headband and the glasses and everything. Some of that I can understand, like the glasses, hiding from the outside world and things like that. But some of it just seemed odd for the sake of being odd. Were there things that people saw in just like the physical nature of the characters that either you thought, oh yeah, that's a perfect representation and I see where he was going with that, or why in the world did he do that? Like the weird hairstyle. Why would the weird hairstyle? Until he cuts it all off, when he's about to commit suicide.
was odd.
Did that just seem like a way of highlighting the general weirdness, or it was like set dressing almost?
Yeah, I think for them, a lot of it was like, well, I was thinking of how like for Richie, the tennis player, I think he was supposed to be like, he was just still really stuck in the past. And so that kind of had that look of the tennis players, years ago, where they would wear the headband like that. And it was definitely gave me like a 70s vibe for that kind of thing. And I think just that idea of their like arrested development, and like even like with Margot with the barrettes, I mean, like, she's like a grown woman and she still wore her hair in a very childlike way. Yeah, he did do a lot of interesting thing with hair. And then when you think of like Ben Stiller and the two kid characters, where they made them all have the same like kind of hair, like little mini me's. It's just interesting. One of the things I read about it said that Gwyneth Paltrow said that when she met with him in like before they filmed it, he had already had all of those details laid out in his mind. Like he already had like the barrettes he wanted her to wear, and the glasses that Anjelica Huston wore were his own mother's.
Oh wow.
And the suits that she wore were based on something of based on the kind of suits his mother wore growing up. And she said, oh, he told her very specific, they have to be, shorter than, above your elbows and all this. And she's like, and she said, Anjelica said when she met with him and he told her all this, she's like, so I'm playing a version of your mother, a version of your mother. And he's like, what? No, my mother has nothing to do with this. And she's like, yeah.
That's funny.
So this is kind of like
Talk about a trope right there.
Yes.
Right. And his parents had gone through a very brutal divorce when he was a
Right.
child. And so oh no, this has nothing to do with autobiography, but it is interesting, in that light. It's not hard to like take a couple steps to see, oh, there's stuff he is still, that really impacted him that he was still trying to kind of figure out.
Yeah, I was surprised to learn that he wasn't the nicest person to work with either.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there was a little bit of him in the character,
Right, in Royal, right? Yeah, I would imagine. I don't know a lot. Like I like his work, but he doesn't tend to give a lot of interviews and stuff now. But you would imagine with that level of detail, he would be incredibly inflexible to work with.
That's what they said. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't imagine he's like any kind of like really, cooperative kind of thing.
It's interesting because so he's the writer, director, and in some ways the stylist too. So like in a lot of movies, you would let a stylist go do these things. So they would probably be more specific. So I mean, like be more deliberate, like either make that person blend in or it's like style them so it's like a name tag almost, so like you have something that you can immediately spot that it's them, especially in an ensemble, right? You need to make them distinctive enough to where they don't just all blend in. So, but I mean, he had this idea from the beginning, and I think it's like what is the Pulp Fiction, the guy who did Pulp Fiction,
Quentin Tarantino.
Quentin Tarantino and like the Coen brothers, like they do a lot of like styling these things too. And like they may not know why they pick these things, but it's on a subconscious level. This is the thing, and they know that will somehow translate. Like maybe all of them don't translate, but they are just trusting their feelings, trusting their gut. That these glasses or the barrette or whatever is somehow important to them. And it reminds me of, there was this controversy a couple of years ago where, I don't know, controversy is a little bit overblown, but this author had put blue curtains in a book, right? And then everyone was discussing like, well, what are the meaning of the blue curtains, right? And the teacher like, what are the meaning of the blue curtains, right? And the author says, they're just blue. I just picked a color out of the, and which is probably totally true, but the fact that it still might have been subconsciously important to her to have picked the blue, and that was the part that it's like this sort of circular logic, right? So she was the stylist there, and it may not have been a deliberate choice, but like maybe the blue did mean something, and the fact that she's discounting her own, just like he's discounting, well, it's not my mother.
Yeah,
maybe it is, right? Maybe the blue curtains were maybe not critical, but maybe I picked them for a reason.
Right. And the like all of our work takes on a life of its own after we publish it. So if like people make a connection and that like works for them, you can't like take it away. You know what I mean? Like even if you didn't intend it, like he's like, oh, this has nothing to do with my mother. But if people like watch it and think, oh, well, that's, he must have had a rough childhood, and that's kind of out there and like beyond, the person's control. And I think that's just kind of a risk that we all have when we do stuff, is we're revealing parts of ourselves and vulnerabilities, and you like, put those things out there, and people can either interpret them or not, and or how they interpret them is not really something we can do much about.
Like also we see movies differently these days, like I don't know about the rest of you, but when I kind of went through the Wikipedia page before I watched it again, right? So like it had been years since I watched it again. I went, which movie is that? Like I think I know. So I kind of went through, oh yeah. So then I get all this trivia
Yeah,
about, right? And then I'm watching it again going, oh yeah, like I wonder if I noticed that, I probably didn't notice a lot of these things back when I watched it in whatever 2007 or 2003. I don't know when it was. It was a long
I
time
think
ago.
it came out in 2000, maybe it came out in 2001 or 2003. Yeah.
Hmm.
And now too, when we watch stuff, I can't remember which platform it is, but there'll be like the little trivia box on the side where you can like, click on stuff to like, so while you're watching it, you can look up all these little facts of like who this person is and what else they're in and what was the bloopers for this scene or something. And so it is really interesting how that has changed our experience of trying to figure all that stuff out. I was curious about what you guys thought about, like, because it was so much of a movie of relationships and like interacting, what you guys thought about like the violence in the movie in terms of like the Richie suicide thing, and even the dad, how he shot the BB gun when they do the flashback and he shot Chaz in the hand as a kid and he still got the BB gun in his hand of like, I don't know. I was just kind of curious what you guys thought about it in the movie.
Well, I did learn, I'll put in air quotes, that the BB was actually one of the actor's hands, like Luke Owens, that he had actually gotten shot with a BB gun, and he still like that hand that shows the lump of the BB was actually one of the character's hands. So that's interestingly one that probably like Wes and whoever were sitting around in the commissary drinking coffee, and Wes said, "Hey, what's that with your hand?" He said, "Oh, I got shot with a BB when I was a kid." And he said, "Oh, that's cool. Let's put it in the movie." So bizarrely, this bizarre combination of I've had this barrette in my, in my prop drawer for a decade, but also I'm going to figure out a way to work in this hand with a BB already in it.
Right.
It's kind of taking advantage of both ends of that spectrum.
Yeah.
I didn't think the suicide scene was necessary. I would have taken that out. I thought it took away from the comedy. So I know it's not a comedy, but from the lightness of it, of that show, it kind of pulled it back. And I thought, I don't want to be pulled back. I want to be in the lightness of the moment. So I did. But the one thing I had to ask you is, what the heck is that pagoda when he sticks him?
Oh,
what is that all about?
Well, I know it does seem kind of weird. I remember he said something about he shivved him years ago, remember?
Right.
He says
right.
That.
But what is that?
Yeah, and so then he's like, oh, somehow he's been a loyal a loyal member of my family for all this time. I think it's just kind of again part of that like fantastical another era, another.
So that meant he liked him, or they were bonded,
I always thought it meant he liked the family or cared about the family, because I think he was with Etheline at that time too.
Right.
But he really saw Royal for who he was.
Okay. But he always went with them. He always sided with them.
Right.
It was such a jarring moment when they both got kicked out.
Right.
And then he shivved him. And then Eugene Hackman's okay with it.
Right. Right.
Don't do it again. I don't know. Okay. Yeah. I just wonder what you thought.
Yeah. No.
Mary, I had a question about what you're saying about the suicide. Are you saying that you would rather not have had the character try to commit suicide at all, or you would have preferred that it not be so sort of like brutally portrayed?
I think both. I don't think it was reflective. I know he was depressed, and I know he loved Margot, but it just was I think it was such a contrast to how I experienced him. Yeah, he had problems, but I thought it took it to another level. It was almost like a ritual, like in Shogun. He's gonna, he's just, and then I also didn't think it had to be. I didn't think it had to be shown. I think that they show after he does it. I'm not sure they show as he does it. I don't remember.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't really feel like I felt the same way about it.
The one of the things that sort of I'm going to pick on all the dog parts. So the part at the end where the dog gets hit by the car, and the way they filmed it, it was very clearly, there was one point where the car has gone up over the curb and it's smashed into the house, and it's very clearly, bizarrely specific that it's kind of gone up over a planter. And so I thought, oh, well, obviously the dog is in in the
Right.
planter and still okay. Like, why else would they show the car in that particular way, in a way that makes it really clear that the dog could survive? But then no, he's really dead. And it also, that was another moment where I was okay with the suicide, because I felt as if, even if it was misplaced, that's, one could argue pro and con, it was still the creator showing empathy toward the character. But a lot of these were just throwaway cruelty. When it was throwaway cruelty, then that's what really took me out of what I felt the tone of the rest of it was, which was sort of fantasy, life, but in Technicolor kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
See, I think they had to get rid of that dog so that he could get him a Dalmatian.
So we could get him another one.
life.
Yeah, it's true.
That was my take, but yeah,
I
thought
think
the
you're
dog
right.
survived.
Yeah. I think the loss of the dog, I think I liked how that turned out in the end, but they'd already lost, didn't they? Oh no, they hadn't. It was their mother who passed away on their mother who died in the airplane crash, and the kids and the dog and the other three of the three humans and the dog survived. Okay, because in my mind I thought they'd lost a dog then too, and I was like, these kids it felt like repetitive, But now that I was remembering, I think they just showed that the dog carrier had gotten was tossed free of the wreckage of the plane, and the dog was fine. So anyway, yeah, I don't know.
So in a moment, I'm going to turn to asking everybody the what pro and con lessons did you want to draw from this? But Jennifer, were there any other kind of, and the other thing I wanted to mention, we were talking a little bit about how certain creators, when they reach a certain level of notoriety, Wes Anderson or Quentin Tarantino, they have their own tropes. Mm-hmm. And I know a year or so ago, there was that, what if Wes Anderson had done Star Wars? Did anybody see that?
No.
Well, you'll have to look for it. It is very funny.
It was so good.
The stormtrooper, and then stormtrooper goes. And I'm sure that if you've watched more Wes Anderson things, the whole thing would be even funnier. But that's a homework assignment for people to go search Wes Anderson Star Wars. But Jennifer, any other large tropes that we haven't hit yet that you'd like to discuss?
I don't think so. I was just trying to think of any other, the violent secondary characters. No, I think we just talked a little bit about the secondary characters, and that was just kind of something that I thought was interesting about that. So I just kind of it was just fun to hear what you guys thought, and I learned some new stuff, and it makes me it's just fun to talk about.
Cool. Well, I am going to start out at the round of what's one thing pro and one thing con that we learned. And I'm fudging a little bit, but I'm going to say I'm using this as a con, even though it's not really a con. But we were talking earlier about readers' reactions. Like, once you put your work out into the world, the readers are going to react in a certain way. And if Wes Anderson actually said, no, it was not about my mom, then I'm using that as an excuse to say that we have to kind of accept readers' reactions and not tell them that they're wrong.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, what they bring to our stories may be completely not what we intended for them to bring to the stories, but I think it's still legitimate. And you never want to get in an argument with someone who's absorbing your creative content and say, no, you interpreted that incorrectly. And then I would say the pro is the idea that he has taken, none of the stuff we've talked about is new. He's taken it to this different and very exaggerated, kind of cartoonish and extreme version in a very effective way. And so if you're considering telling a story and you're like, oh no, I can't do that because that's already been done. Well, every story's already been done a million times. What is it? There are only 6 stories out there. I forget what the theory is, but don't let the fact that somebody else has addressed something discourage you from telling a story, as long as you're telling it your own way. So that would be my pro and con. Anybody else have a pro and con they'd like to share?
I want to piggyback on that only because I totally agree. And that was one thing I was thinking of, he put this out a long time ago when he was famous, but not as famous as he is now. And I think it's like there can be an urge to make your work more generic in hopes of reaching more people. And I think having the courage to kind of really let your voice show and let your stories let your, what do you call, freak flag fly of like what you really want to say out there, as opposed to trying like watering it down, I think is really our like storytelling secret weapon. And the way, and then he just effectively did that by using tropes that like connect with relationships we've all had. So I think that's kind of like the biggest thing I take away is like, I loved the kind of richness of this. And like Maddie was saying, it's like it's a basic story we've heard before, but told in a new way. And then the con was just with me. Yeah, I could have lived without.
And Jennifer, I'm gonna jump in real quickly with a shameless plug for what you just said with an episode of the Indie Author Podcast. So episode 191 is called Running at the Creative Risk with Doug Dorst, who was the co-author along with J.J. Abrams of the book S. I interviewed Doug about that, but exactly what you're saying. That idea that watering it down is not what you want to do. If you have an idea, you want to run at it in order to realize your creative vision. So I'm sorry, your con.
I totally agree with that. And my con was just, I too didn't love the suicide violence and felt like it did jerk me out. I felt there were other ways. I understood like storytelling wise, okay, they had to do like this kind of, life or death kind of moment, but I felt like he's a smart enough guy. He could have come up with something else. But anyway, those were my things, and I love it. And I'm so happy to like talk to you guys about it.
Cool. Thank you. Mary or Roland, pros and cons, you thought?
Okay. The pros is that I think he did a beautiful job in tackling a topic that every family goes through. I don't care how good you think your family is and how nice. He was able to just highlight some of the deep struggles that families go through in order to find their way back to one another. So I think I would love to be able to create that in writing. The negative is I think there was a lot of wasted stuff in there I would have taken out, but then I don't know how much would have been left of the movie. So I think there was stuff that didn't really need to be there.
Can you give an example of one of those things?
Well, the whole thing with the hotel he was staying in, and and then he works there, and I didn't. Okay, so and I don't think they would have hired him anyway. So I didn't. It was unbelievable to me, that whole bit. So
even within I think a lot of it was unbelievable, but Wes Anderson kind of establishes the reality of his world. And so as outlandish as everything else is, it's still possible to find things that seem not to be complying with the rules that he's established for the rest of that world.
But even the whole bit with the bird was more believable at the end than him working in the hotel.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was the same bird, but he looked different. But there are all these questions.
Roland, what do you think? A pro and con from?
I'll start with the cons. It's something we didn't really talk about much, but it's genre expectations and matching genre expectations. Because when I saw it in the movie theater originally, and I think the trailers at the time made it look like an Owen Wilson, Ben Stiller comedy.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people, no one in the movie theater liked it except for me and a couple of my friends, because we're like Raising Arizona and the Coen Brothers fans and stuff like that. So this is like quirky, offbeat humor. And somehow one of us knew about what it was. So we went in knowing. But the other people are like, what is it? Like, some people left, right? Because it wasn't funny, So you can make sure your cover is right, your book description is right, your you gotta like sort of telegraph to the potential reader, or the what it is, like what they're going to experience in there, and continuing in with like the look inside of the first chapter. And then the pro was, I feel like I learned how I've connected now how I can use the opening and also like of my book to sort of show the expectations of what they're going to find inside. Whether if it's urban fantasy, so like right off the bat, maybe I need to have something that's like, maybe there should be a vampire in the first couple of paragraphs, or like some sort of sense of magic or something, just so everyone knows, right? And hey, you bought this because it's a vampire book, or there's magic and paranormal stuff in here. I'm going to honor that. So here's a little bit just to make sure that you know that I'm telling the truth. And then after that, you sort of set the stage for how things go. Because if you don't, then you're just gonna disappoint.
I like that, using the I'm going to honor that. I don't think I've ever heard anybody describe the complying with the expected tropes of a genre quite that way, but I think that's a really nice way of framing it up.
I was just going to throw in real quick, Roland. I just read, because your fantasy, this, and I've been working on a little thing talking about it, but this book called Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros, and whether you like the book or not, it does an excellent job in the first 3 pages of setting up all the things we've been talking about. You don't, if there's no change anyway. So I just was kind of like, oh, the masterfulness of like, it has 88,000 reviews on Amazon. I don't even know how that's possible. Yeah. It's crazy. It's like a fantasy Hunger Games kind of thing. And there's a lot of stuff that's like, but it's like wildly popular. And I think part of the reason is because she completely respects the genre expectations, lays it out in the beginning, and, people who want that, she's delivering that to them. So I think it's interesting to look at from that standpoint of view. So
I'll check that out.
Yeah.
So cool. Well, thanks, the 3 of you, Jennifer, Mary, and Roland, for joining us for this conversation. And if anyone who's listening to this would like to join a live event, you can do that by becoming a patron of The Indie Author. You can go to theindyauthor.com/Patreon, and that's Indie with a Y, INDY. And if you follow my Facebook page at The Indie Author, you'll hear about upcoming events. So, maybe if you're on the fence, you'll see an upcoming patron-only event that strikes your fancy, and that will push you over the fence, so to speak. That's more violent than what I really intend, but I think you know what I'm trying to say. So thanks all of you so much for joining, and hope to see you next time.